আচ্ছা, মনে হচ্ছে লাইভটা শুরু হয়েছে। আমি চেষ্টা করি। হ্যাঁ, উই আর লাইভ। আচ্ছা, আপনার কথাটা কি শোনা যাচ্ছে? পরিষ্কার আসছে?
শোনা যাচ্ছে।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, নমস্কার বন্ধুরা। আনন্দ গ্রুপ অফ কন্টেম্পোরারি স্টাডিজের 4th ওয়েবিনারে আপনাদের সকলকে স্বাগত জানাই। এবং আপনারা জানেন যে এই কোভিডের সময় যেহেতু এখন কোনো অফলাইন কিছু করা সম্ভব হচ্ছে না, তো সে কারণেই আমাদের এটা ওয়েবিনার ফরম্যাটে করতে হচ্ছে। তো ফলত আপনারা সকলে জানেন যে আজকের বিষয় হেসনাম কানহাইলালের ওপর, এবং আমাদের যিনি আজকে বলবেন অধ্যাপক ট্রিনা নীলিনা বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়। উনি সেন্টার ফর স্টাডিজ ইন সোশ্যাল সায়েন্সেসে পড়ান, এবং এই লেকচার সেশনটা মডারেট করছেন প্রদোষ ভট্টাচার্য। শ্রী প্রদোষ ভট্টাচার্য এখন ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ ওয়ারউইকের একজন ডক্টরাল স্কলার থিয়েটার অ্যান্ড পারফরমেন্স স্টাডিজে। তো আমি খুব বেশিক্ষণ সময় নিচ্ছি না। আর একটা কথা বলবো যে এই সেশনে আপনাদের প্রশ্ন বা যদি কোনো কমেন্ট করার থাকে, আপনারা এই কমেন্ট সেকশন বক্সে করতে পারেন। ইংরেজি এবং বাংলা দুটোতেই প্রশ্ন আমরা নিতে পারি। Good evening, friends. Welcome to the 4th webinar of the Group of Contemporary Studies. So today we have with us Professor Trina Nileena Banerjee of Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. And this lecture session will be moderated by Prodosh Bhattacharya, a doctoral scholar at the University of Warwick in the Department of Theatre and Performance Studies. So, and this time this question answer session will be both in Bangla and English as well. So you can post all your questions or comments in the comment section box, both in English and Bangla. So without any further delay, over to you, Prodosh.
Thank you, Navanilda. I thank Ananda Group of Contemporary Studies for organizing this and giving me this opportunity to moderate this session. It's indeed a pleasure, to be a part of this webinar today. And though, Trinadi needs no introduction, but as it's the order of the day, so I will briefly introduce her. So Dr. Trina Nileena Banerjee completed her MA in English Literature from Jadavpur University. And then she proceeded to complete a Master of Studies in English at the University of Oxford. For her PhD, she worked on a history of women in group theatre movement in Bengal between 1950 and 1980. She has also been researching the interfaces between women's movement and political theatre in contemporary Manipur for several years now. Her essays and reviews on these and other subjects have appeared in national and international journals, as well as in several edited volumes. She writes both in English and in Bangla. Between 2011 and 2013, she taught at the Theatre and Performance Studies Department at the School of Arts and Aesthetics in Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is currently Assistant Professor in Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. Her essays, she writes, as already said, in both Bengali and English. Her research interests include gender, performance, political theatre, theories of the body, post-colonial theatre, and South Asian history. She has also been a theatre and fiction writer. Her book, Performing Silence, Women in Group Theatre Movement, Bengal, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press in June 2021. So it's great honor and privilege to welcome Trinadi amidst us. And, it's an apt time, probably, not just because of COVID, but also because of, the way things are in terms of a certain coercive and dangerous surrogacy happening in the political sphere around, that we remember Heisnam Kanhailal and of course, we will also remember Ima Savitri and Manipur Kalakhetra. So the practice of resilience is something which is very important and essential during these times, and none better than Professor Banerjee to kind of enlighten us on these. So a warm welcome to Trinadi. Over to you.
Thank you, Prodosh, for that introduction, and thank you, Nabunil, for inviting me to do this. It is indeed becoming, we were just talking before we went live, it's becoming more and more difficult to sort of keep working as if, everything remains unchanged, while really in terms of the political world around us, in terms of what her lives have become because of the pandemic, and as well as how, both the state and capital are instrumentalizing the pandemic in order to sort of serve various kinds of ends. It does become our links, in fact, to the past, to a certain kind of political continuum, seem to be becoming more and more tenuous and hard to hold on to. We're not just losing people, but we're also losing touch with experiences of collectivity, of perhaps our confidence in a certain kind of political resilience. I mean, there's spurts which give us inspiration, the recent farmers' protests, or Shaheen Bagh last year, but again and again we feel pushed to the ground, I guess, as a democratic polity. And it does then also become crucial, however hard it may seem, to look back at the past, perhaps, in order to understand where we find ourselves in the present. Um, I I know that for people who know of Kanhailal Heisnam's work, he's often remembered primarily by sort of that one sort of absolutely exceptional moment of the staging of Draupadi, because it became such a political watershed in so many ways. Because it was soon followed by the Kangla protest, and it was, it almost became proleptic for Manipur's and the subcontinent's political history, the staging of Draupadi. But I wanted also in my recent work, I mean, I'm drawing in this lecture from an essay, a long essay that I wrote after the demise of Kanhailal for Sangeet Natak Academy journal, which it's still to come, be published, but it was commissioned and edited by Professor Shomik Bandyopadhyay, and I'm sort of drawing on that. And in this essay, I was ruminating primarily on the connections between the oral and performative culture of Manipur and Kanhailal's political theatre. So, in a sense, this connection between orality and text, in fact, because a lot of us who are trained in conventional theatre studies are sort of, or even literary studies, are taught to look at performance for a long time as primarily as text, and or at least if not quite the same as a literary text, we talk of something like a performance text. We talk of, or we find it hard to imagine sort of a theatrical performance without a text that precedes it. But in many ways, and this is one of the sort of, Pradush will know, one of the driving forces of performance studies as a field of, of research, that performance requires a certain kind of autonomous engagement as a field of knowledge in itself, which remains beyond textuality in many ways, in many cultures, where the primary form of transmission of knowledge is a certain kind of culture of embodied performance. And Manipur, especially, the Meitei sort of community in Manipur, is deeply embedded in a very, very rich sort of oral culture. And it is very difficult to understand Kanhailal's political theatre without understanding his kind of rootedness in this orality. And of course, we as theorists of performance will think of, Gugi's work, think of orature, think of, perhaps Diana Taylor's notion of the the archive and the repertoire. But I think beyond all of that, Kanhailal had a sort of very self-conscious conception of what his real sources were. And if we are to read today some of his interviews and his essays, we find it very clear that he knows that he's drawing from a certain kind of sort of local history, far more than the influences that have been attributed to him. Say either Badal Sarkar from Bengal or Grotowski from Europe. These have often been seen as points of influence for Kanhailal's work, but in his own words, he again and again reiterates his indebtedness to Meitei sort of oral cultural sources, oral and performative cultural sources. Am I audible to everyone? I don't know if I'm loud enough.
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah. All right. So this is, I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And can I request Prodosh to sort of warn me when I have about 5 minutes left? So I'm starting at 6:50. I should end by sort of 35 minutes past 7. If Pradosh can just kind of give me a bit of a warning when I have 5 minutes left, and then we can open this for questions. And if I do not remain, and at the end I will show a few stills. I'll try to share my screen, but that's once we have finished. And if I stop being audible or visible at any point, just let me know, right?
Sure.
All right. So this lecture is called Revisiting Kanhailal Heisnam, the storyteller of his people. The art of storytelling is coming to an end. Less and less frequently do we encounter people with the ability to tell a tale properly. More and more often, there is embarrassment all around when the wish to hear a story is expressed. It is as if something that seemed inalienable to us, the securest among our possessions, were taken from us, the ability to exchange experiences. This is Walter Benjamin, and he's writing these lines in the year 1936 in the aftermath of the First World War and in the build-up towards the Second. The latter would ultimately take his life in 1940, as we all know. In the essay, later anthologized in Illuminations, edited and introduced by Hannah Arendt, Benjamin attributes the decline of storytelling to the growing dominance of a new category of communication: information. Information lays claim to prompt verifiability and must immediately appear plausible, in contrast to which storytelling recedes into the intelligence of yesteryears, more aligned to traces of a miraculous view of life. With the gradual disappearance of the art of storytelling, our ability to communicate about shared experiences had also firmly vanished, claims Benjamin. Throughout his life, Kanhailal Heisnam continually drew inspiration from the storytelling practices of his own people. Whether it be in the 1975 political allegory Pebet, which drew directly on the Fungawari, which is a Meitei term, or fireside tale tradition of the Meitei community. So these were stories that were traditionally told by the older generation in the family to the young grandchildren. So quite literally something like Thakumar Jhuli, but except that it's never sort of inscribed or written down. So these stories passed. Mostly they were animal fables, and they would pass from one generation to the other during winter time when the family gathered around the fire. Or in his later work, Daghor 2006, where strands of Manipuri folklore and myth mingled with the primary tenor of Tagore's classic dramatic text. It could be argued that Draupadi 2000, staged in the year 2000, perhaps Kanhailal's best-known work, communicated the story of the brutal political violence in the Northeast with the piercing emotional intensity of a myth, the reality of which resonated eerily across time, and we find a telling historical echo in the Kangla protest of 2004. The staging of the play, which remains a watershed moment in the theatrical landscape of the subcontinent, tore through layers of carefully curated, governmentally approved information on the state of Manipur and rewrote a history that had been systematically erased from the status narratives of national integration. While pondering on the unique character of Kanhailal's work, H.S. Shiva Prakash has written, Kanhailal's theatre indubitably has elements of mythology and mysticism. At the same time, it has dimensions that rarely collocate with mythology and mysticism, a constant and consistent engagement with history and politics. We might ask, did Kanhailal's engagement with myth and his embeddedness in the collective memory of his people allow him to articulate his historical reality in ways that were unexplored within the more limited idioms of political theatre in the subcontinent? In many ways, Kanhailal's work flies in the face of these definitional and generic constraints, militating as it does against both the propagandist and the spectacular. Kanhailal envisions the body of the performer in a search for resonance, like a musical instrument in search for the perfect note. The ability to touch that note, in its absolute fragility and transience, is to touch the truth about collective trauma, communitarian memory, and historical erasure. Hitting this note hits several registers at once: the historical, the mythical, and the contemporary. Some of us might remember Agamben's essay, Georgia Agamben's essay, What is Contemporary, here, where Agamben says something like, the true contemporary finds himself placed at the crack on the broken back of time. So this is this beautiful, I don't remember the exact words, so this beautiful image that Agamben gives us, which is that the contemporary is he who is always out of step with his time, not quite always in step. And where does he find himself? He finds himself, it's as if the spine of our time, the backbone has been broken, and it is at the place that backbone has been broken, the contemporary, the truly contemporary artist finds himself stationed. So the tragedy, the brokenness of our time, and the wound of it is where the truly contemporary artist or thinker would find himself located. So this is just an aside, because we are talking about what it means to be contemporary. So hitting this note hits several registers at once: the historical, the mythical, and the contemporary. Kanhailal's theatre at its best resonates simultaneously on these multiple registers, and in so doing, shapes a unique language of performance within which the historical reality of modern-day Manipur is condensed. Commentators have ruminated on the influence of figures like Badal Sarkar and the Polish director Jerzy Grotowski on Kanhailal's work. Kanhailal's own writing, however, records a very different set of influences. He admits that many have, and this often happens in theatre history, not just in the case of Manipur, but also in Bengal, that certain truisms become a sort of, by the sheer force of repetition, because so many people keep repeating it, become established facts. And when you go back to the sources, you find that a very different kind of narrative emerges. So it's true that the influence of Grotowski and the influence of Badal Sarkar has often been mentioned in talking about Kanhailal's work, but when you look at his own writing, something else emerges, a different set of influences. He admits that many have claimed that Sarkar was his mentor, but he also asserts that soon after the first encounter with Badal Sarkar in 1972, the members of Kalakshetra began to realize the discrepancies that existed between Sarkar's methodology and their own artistic quest, a split that was perhaps rooted in his understanding of Sarkar's work as primarily urban. In speaking of the psychophysical exercises that helped to shape the pedagogic trajectory of Kalakshetra, Kanhailal writes, "We learned these techniques from our orally transmitted ancestral tradition, and our understanding of it was enhanced by the fact that we were rooted in and closely connected to our traditional life. In his essay titled Ritual Theatre, tracing the trajectory of his own work, Kanhailal speaks of a number of individuals who have influenced Kalakshetra's artistic style and method of training over the years. I quote, "We are bound to acknowledge the guidance of Guru Gaurkishore Sharma and Guru Ibotombi Singh, Thangta, Ima Yamshang Maibi, Guru Achoibi Sena, and Pandit Kulachandra, Maibi ritual performance and Lai Haroba, Oja Achao and Oja Manglem, Moirang Parva, the folk operatic theatre, Professor Nilakanta, Manipuri art and culture, Oja K.C. Tensuba, Vipassana meditation, etc., etc., etc." Merely glancing through the names of these experts gives us a sense of the diverse range of local resources and art practices that Kanhailal drew inspiration from: Thangta, Lai Haroba, Maibi oracular performances, folk theatre, and meditation practices. In his writing, which has seldom been examined in detail in relation to his theatrical work, Kanhailal refers to the deep impact that the spoken language of traditional trainers and gurus had on his thinking. So there's this essay, and I'm going to be quoting from it, where he's trying to describe what the guru said when conducting a class. What was the language of their pedagogy? How would they speak to the students, quite literally? Kanhailal writes, "I found curious and fresh the metaphors used by the traditional artists and masters I worked with. Moon on the water, the floating body, the throat does not sing. Place your soul in the space. Plant the body in the earth. Transform your trunk into waves," and so on. I'll repeat the phrases. Moon on the water, the floating body, the throat does not sing. Place your soul in the space. Plant the body in the earth. Transform your trunk into waves. Sometimes, with very few words or through silence, the master created, as a sculptor does, a body in life of the student. He goes on to suggest that perhaps a more objective pedagogy for traditional performance knowledge might be found when these metaphors are more exactly calibrated into descriptive language. But for the moment, Kanhailal must rely on the inadequate approximations to translate them for his academic contemporary. So this is not just a matter of translation from Meitei loan to English, but also translating a certain kind of metaphorical fluidity that refers to certain bodily states into a certain kind of textual approximation that might make sense. However, as clues for an actor seeking a physical language that resonates with the shared experiences of an embattled community, these metaphors are invaluable. Kanhailal's actor then seeks to embody, not explicate, not explicate, the truth about collective memories of violence through a localized mode of storytelling that is simultaneously deeply grounded in political history and rooted in myth. Shiva Prakash, for example, sees no contradiction in the coming together of the mythical and the political. In making his point, he goes back to the arguments proposed by Wole Soyinka on Yoruba tragedy in his book Myth, Literature, and African Reality. So, Soyinka writes, countering the argument, Shiva Prakash writes, countering the argument that tragedy is an escape from history, Soyinka argues that ritualistic theatre affects the renewal of history. The ritualistic actor then, according to Soyinka, withdraws from the linearity of chronological time in order to enter a realm of pure possibilities, from which he returns renewed to face, once again, the demands of historical necessity. It could be argued that Kanhailal's rootedness in Meitei cosmology came together with a strikingly modern sensibility in order to mold the foundational classics that defined his theatrical career. So I'm going to skip over the details of his early life because these are easily found in a sort of a couple of the collections that have come out, about his work. But let's go to that moment in 1963 when he travels to the National School of Drama. In 1963, Kanhailal applied to the National School of Drama with the recommendation of Binodini Devi. becoming the second Manipuri to be ever admitted to that institution. His time at NSD, however, proved to be difficult. He was unable to adjust to the linguistic and cultural demands made on him as a student in the nation's capital. He found himself marginalized and cornered because of his inability to speak in Hindi, the language of communication and instruction at the school. Finding it difficult to cope with the conditions he was faced with, he took leave without permission and was soon expelled on disciplinary grounds. Savitri Heisnam says of the time, and this was an interview that I had done with her in 1970, in 2017, when she had the last performance of Draupadi in Kolkata. So Oja was and she used to call, like many of us call Kanhailal Oja. Oja in the Meitei language means teacher, and it's a generic term that is used for wise men and women in Meitei culture. So Oja was expelled from NSD. This was because he did not know Hindi properly. It was during the time of Al-Qazi. My father-in-law was angry. And he said he went away when he had the responsibility for his wife and two sons. On the other side, Oja was feeling shy and reluctant to come back home. He wrote me letters during those days. He wrote, "This must be the time when you want to eat special things," since I was pregnant at that time. "I do not earn and cannot send you money. Bear it for some time, my dear." I read the letter while I was cooking and I cried. I was very young. This is the story. Later, he came back home. Then we established Kalakshetra Manipur. Kanhailal returned to Manipur in May 1969 and spent a couple of months not knowing what to do with his life. He remembers this as a period of uncertainty and confusion. His friends in Imphal and Savitri convinced him to return to the theatre, and in July 1969, Heisnam established his own theatre group, Kalakshetra. What was it like to return from New Delhi, a place where his cultural and linguistic identity had all but been violently erased, to Manipur, where he now realized he must live and work? Did the rejection and alienation he encountered in the institutional corridors at the nation's center embitter him towards the possibilities of cultural expression in a peripheral space that was all but invisible to the visionaries who shaped mainstream Indian theatre? It appears that this time in Kanhailal's life was marked by perplexity, but certainly not a personal bitterness that could in any way mar his creative trajectory. In fact, a realization of the inevitability of his alienation drove him to seek inspiration in exactly those resources that had recently appeared to him to be without value in the academic spaces of the nation's capital. It would perhaps be safe to say that he realized the essentially political nature of his own experience and identified within it the historical symptoms of his community's oppression. Instead of turning inward, then, Kanhailal successfully avoided a fruitless solipsism in order to seek fuel for his art in localized stores of mythical and folkloric knowledge. He writes of this difficult time. "Due to my deeply rooted rural and introverted nature, I failed to immediately adapt to a life in the city. Despite the setback, I could have had a chance of surviving the National School of Drama in Delhi had I at least had a working knowledge of Hindi. But my dream of becoming a trained theatre artist," and we know all of us how ironic this is that we are reading of this experience now, where a part of sort of negotiating with a sort of top-down ideology now also means to kind of constantly having to sort of assert the linguistic autonomy of the regions against what appears to be the only possible, language of the state, which is a certain kind of constructed statist Hindi. But my dream of becoming a trained theatre artist was shattered with my termination from the NSD at the beginning of the session in 1968. Though I was deeply affected by the termination, I did not lose hope and chose to transform this situation of failure into a challenge of self-learning. I began to look afresh at my own Meitei ethnic past, the ancestral past of natural lore and native lore. Many of us who are familiar with political histories of left theatre immediately feel slightly uncomfortable or alienated by this kind of turn towards folklore, nature, etc. It seems as if one is turning into an anti-political or apolitical space. So I ask, was this a turn away from politics and a withdrawal into the safer, arguably less conflicted recesses of the conveniently mystical? Or was there a way in which Meitei cultural and religious assertion channelized its traumatic relation with the political oppression of the present day by an urgent reshaping of the mythical and the political? A glance at the trajectory of Meitei political assertion in later years, especially in the 1980s, would provide us with a sort of answer. But for our purposes, it should be sufficient to turn to Kanhailal's own subsequent work. Heisnam Kanhailal writes about the phase after Kanhailal's return to Manipur. The rejection and alienation suffered in New Delhi brought him closer to home. It should also be acknowledged that without the rupture from his cultural roots, Kanhailal would have never gained a clearer idea of himself. In an interview with Bharucha that took place in Imphal in May 1990, Kanhailal admits that his withdrawal from the metropolitan and urban culture at this time was by no means a simple return to romantic, sentimentalized notions of oppression. Rather, on his return to Imphal, he was gradually able to overcome his prejudices against urban people in order to be able to recognize their vulnerabilities, and this brought him a new awareness of his own artistic methods. Manipur was also a state that was semi-urban and semi-rural, with all the contradictions of a conflicted encounter with modernity marking its own territory, right, and its history. So I read somewhere, I mean, on some sort of a mainstream platform a couple of days back that India lives in several centuries at the same time, and that's true of the subcontinent. Whether or not we subscribe to that notion of the nation state. That there are obviously simultaneous and very, very messy modernities that we are encountering. Kanhailal admits that over time he grew into a sharper awareness of this messiness and complexity in his own culture. And he writes, "Now I was able to clarify what I liked and what I didn't like about metropolitan culture. I learned what I had to preserve and what I had to remove from the understanding of my own culture. And I developed a new consciousness of my process. I found the question of survival to be very intense in urban areas. Here in Imphal, we don't think of tomorrow. This affects our theatre." I think this is fascinating, these last two sentences. Here in Imphal, we don't think of tomorrow. This affects our theatre. I mean, he's talking in 1919, things have changed. But in a sense, perhaps, along with all the other sort of connotations of that statement, one is talking about being somehow, and this is after 10 years of the imposition of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And elsewhere I've written about, time and nation, and especially what happens to the experience of time under military law. Whether it is in a sense out of step with this kind of experience of the linearity of a certain kind of time defined by the imagined community of the nation state, which Benedict Anderson talks about, that we are in a sense tied together by the newspaper, the morning reading of the newspaper. Are we, in a sense, tied together by the 9 o'clock news where the nation wants to know? And there is a certain kind of linearity to that kind of developmental time of the nation state. And even in the early years when I was visiting Manipur, I had a distinct sense that one was out of step with that time, because time moved differently under curfew, under, that kind of exceptional state of, sort of military law defining every aspect of your life. So, but putting that aside, what he says here is here in Imphal, we don't think of tomorrow. That affects our theatre. In 1972, the Bengali director Badul Sarkar came to Imphal in order to perform at a festival organized by the Manipur State Academy. 4 of his plays were being staged at this festival, including Evam Indrajit. As Kanhailal has recorded in many later interviews, he was deeply influenced by Sarkar's visit and immediately struck by his pedagogic and directorial methods. The young Kanhailal visited Sarkar in Calcutta in 1973 and spent 3 weeks training with him, studying his methods closely. He attempted to learn the psychophysical exercises that Sarkar employed in his actors' training, and some of these, he later realized, were deeply influenced by the then globally influential Polish director Jerzy Grotowski. And this is the 1970s. Grotowski is really big at this point. This was followed in 1973 by the staging of a workshop production of Spartacus by Sarkar in Imphal. Several young directors and theatre workers of Imphal participated in this production, including Kanhailal, who assisted Sarkar's directorial work. Spartacus was staged in Imphal in an open mandap where many Manipuri, and this part is important, it's not just talking about a particular space, which is contingent, but this is important. So Spartacus was, we're talking about third theater in Bengal, its kind of founder, and Spartacus was staged in Imphal in an open mandap where many Manipuri traditional performances, including some segments of the fertility festival of Lai Haroba and the courtyard theatre Shumang Leela, which literally translates as courtyard theatre. It's often been called the Manipuri Jatra by Indian scholars, but that's not quite it. So Shumang Leela are customarily present at the mandap. Proscenium theatre was a thing of fairly recent advent in Manipur, with the first commercial theatre companies coming up in Imphal in the early 20th century under the influence of Bengali directors from Calcutta, and it gained popular acceptance only in the 1930s. Looked at in this way, Sarkar's methods were simultaneously novel and familiar to young Manipuri theatre enthusiasts, insofar as the turn away from the constricting box frame of the proscenium stage took them closer to the communitarian spatial dynamics of their traditional performance practices. In view of this, Bharucha's comment on Sarkar's influence on Manipuri theatre practice of the 1970s appears misleading, according to me. Truly, Sarkar's intervention can be considered historic insofar as it inspired the first non-proscenium theatre movement in Manipur. Now, this is only if you choose to completely sort of disregard the fact that Manipuri theatre performance practices have, in fact, always been, outside the proscenium. The Shumang Leela, the Moirang Parva, bits and pieces of the Lai Haroba, the Maibi trance performances, all of them, none of them have anything to do with the proscenium. So, contrary to what this statement seems to suggest, the most conventional and ritual performance in Manipur, as well as the most popular forms of live entertainment even today, take place outside the proscenium space. Festivals like the Lai Haroba have traditionally involved intense community participation, to the extent that the distinctions between the spectators and performers often continue to be blurred in most events of performance. Kanhailal, in the years to follow, was soon to realize the limitations of Sarkar's techniques for his own context. In his later years, looking back on the significance of this influence, he wrote, "Meanwhile, I met Badal Sarkar. He was excited about a performance of physical language, and we became close. We learned psychophysical exercises, playmaking, and other games of trust, almost in the context of de-urbanization, besides his philosophy of theatre as social action. Later, we realized the discrepancy between his system and our vision of a new aesthetic. But we greatly benefited from our relationship because he showed us clues that help us guide towards objective research and the history of oppression and resistance." In Bharucha's analysis, this discrepancy arose from Kanhailal's realization that many of Sarkar's exercises were futile in the context of Manipur, where actors from a primarily rural and agricultural background needed to be trained differently. While Sarkar's training was useful in freeing urban actors in Kolkata from their socially acquired physical inhibitions, and we are talking mostly of Bhadralok actors here, this was due to the absence of a strong physical culture in a predominantly verbal Bengali theatre. Bharucha writes, Kanhailal realized that his actors did not need to be freed in quite the same way, because those inhibitions in a sort of almost regularly in a quotidian physical culture, where in fact most members of the family performed something or the other in every household, did not exist. In the early 1970s, Manipur was already in the throes of a political churning, which led the Meitei people towards a vigorous reassertion of their own cultural and linguistic identity against what was seen as the unjust and colonizing domination of the mainstream Hindu Indian culture. I've been speaking quite sort of without an interruption. Am I audible? Are there any points that I need to go over again? If you want to tell me.
Completely audible. It's fine.
Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So in the early 1970s, Manipur was already in the throes of a kind of political churning, which led the Meitei people towards a vigorous reassertion of their own cultural and linguistic identity, against what was seen as the unjust and colonizing domination of mainstream Hindu Indian culture. Strands of this political awakening would find forceful representation in Kanhailal's artistic endeavors through the 1970s and 80s, but the process arguably began with the staging of the play Tamnalai in 1972. Tamnalai translates as the haunting spirit. Lai is spirit. Lai Haroba. So, the worship and celebration of spirits. This was also the beginning of Kanhailal's lifelong pursuit and commitments towards the allegorical retelling of Meitei folk tales, which he molded into telling commentaries on the contemporary political predicament of his people. In interviews, both Kanhailal and Sabitri Heisnam recognized Tamnalai as a turning point in the performance history of Kalakshetra, Manipur. Kanhailal took up a traditional folktale about a Manipuri widow's lazy son who ultimately marries a princess and turned it into a critical political narrative of the present state of hooliganism in Meitei society. So, so this is difficult to explain unless you actually look at the sort of the economic and political history of Manipur in the 1970s, and you'll find that actually, like most of India at this time, unemployment is a serious concern among the youth. And in Manipur, this acquires a sort of added political complication because it was found that often jobs in the civil services and governmental jobs went to people from the mainland rather than people who belong to the state of Manipur, and this was becoming a point of political sort of resentment and unhappiness among the younger generations of Manipur who felt that they did not have jobs in their own region, and quite rightly so. And also, as if you know a little bit about the history of Manipur, you know that many of the sort of the major trade trades were run by North Indians and West Indians, Marwaris and people from the Hindi heartland. Still, I mean, they've been sort of generationally sort of domiciled in Manipur for decades, sometimes more than a century. But the point is that often there was a sense that the bigger businesses and the bigger trades were owned by people from the mainland, as well as the best jobs would go to people who came from the mainland. So the unemployment acquired this kind of added political edge as a problem in Manipur, which may not have had in the mainland at this time. So this meant that large sort of sections of the youth were in fact sort of without a means of livelihood, without engagement, and this led to a certain kind of a culture of violence, small time kind of what is known as Gundaism in Manipur, and this was a sort of a kind of standing problem in much of the social and cultural commentary of the time that emerges from Imphal. So, so this is yeah. So in his play, a lazy son of folklore becomes a hardworking poor man who is unemployed yet hopeful about his future. He is caught in a humiliating situation where he is bullied every day by a group of goons who heckle and insult him. Pushed to the brink, he loses his temper one day and kills his tormentors, putting an end to his hopes about future success and prosperity. Like a lot of Kanhailal's later plays, the strength of the play was not so much in the plot but in the telling, especially in the physical language of expression that the actors were able to develop. Kanhailal used a chorus of three old men in the play as commentators on the unfolding scene of tragedy, a first for Manipuri theatre, according to Bharucha. Kanhailal writes, in the latter part of 1972, Tamnalai created an intimacy between Badal Sarkar and us. Um, Critics started to say that Sarkar was Kanhailal's mentor. But the fact was that Tamnalai was able to strike at the root of the spectator's senses. We learned these techniques from orally transmitted ancestral tradition. You see, the thing with Kanhailal is he never denies that the encounter with Sarkar was important, but he every time he says it, he also immediately later sort of highlights the fact that his most sort of significant influences came from his own culture. So these techniques came from an orally transmitted ancestral tradition, and our understanding of it was enhanced by the fact that we were rooted in and closely connected with our traditional life. Kanhailal's assessment of his own artistic development at this time clearly credits the defining influence of the folkloric and ritual tradition he found himself embedded in. By this time, Sabitri had emerged as an important collaborator in Kanhailal's work process, the couple having established a symbolic dialogue that allowed them to carve out their own voices in tandem as actor and director. This intense creative partnership continued till the end of Kanhailal's life in October 2016. We find interesting details of this collaborative preparation for Tamnalai emerging from Sabitri's reminiscences of the time. And this was an interview. So this is 1 second. Let me just check whether. Yes, so this was the interview, the long interview I had done with Sabitri Heisnam for Prodosh Gender Trust when it was recorded as the Rituparna Ghosh Memorial Lecture, and this was transcribed and translated primarily by Rojo Usha, but the interview was between Sabitri and myself. So Sabitri says, the rehearsals for this play were on when one night during the Gangnai festival of the Kabui tribe, we heard the ritual song of the Kabui called Lam Lendu. Savitri sings, and so there is, we have the song on record because she actually demonstrated the song for us. So it's a kind of haunting, repetitive, sort of ritual chant. So Oja woke up at the sound of this singing, and then he woke me up. We sat up on the bed in the middle of the night, listening to the Kabui sing. He asked me to listen carefully to the sound of chanting. Then he told me to remember how the dog howls at night. He said to me, combine those two sounds, the howling of the dog and the chanting of the Kabui tribe. Combine those two sounds and create your own sound of lamentation for the last scene of the play, Tamnalai. I don't like the melodrama and the realist styles of crying. Create something new. This is what he said to me. I thought about it for a long time. I practiced, and then one day I asked him to listen. She laments, and this is what happens in the interview. She laments in a voice that floats somewhere between a haunting chant and an animal's howl of pain. So that became the last scene of the play. It gave something to the audience. Many scholars and theatre reviewers at the time said that Tamlalai was a masterpiece. This play is studied as part of the BA Manipuri course. The rather strange story of the way in which Kanhailal and Sabitri Heisnam came upon the form of final lamentation in Tamnalai, in my view, holds a clue towards the unique physical language that we find evolving in Kanhailal's later plays. Pebet, 1975, Loy, a solo improvisation by Sabitri, which took place in the National School of Drama in 1984. Loy is the term used in Meitei Lon for the outcast, the one who lives outside the village. And of course, you know that the caste system entered Meitei society with kind of Hindu and Vaishnav domination. And so the Sanamahi religion, which preceded, which is an animistic religion, which was, the predominant religion of the Meitei people before Hinduism became influential there, has no inherent caste system. But a certain Brahminism entered from Bengal into Manipur several centuries before today, and has thereafter also sort of established the caste system in a certain way within Meitei society. So the law is basically the outcast. Memoirs of So I'm trying to say that this description of this kind of howl, and how Sabitri comes upon it as an actor through Kanhailal's collaboration. The wailing mother lamenting her son combines an animal, so it's neither realistic nor is it melodramatic. So it's not the proscenium political theatre, nor is it the melodramatic style of Manipuri commercial theatre or religious performance. Like the Chaitanya Leela, etc. It Kanhailal suggests that something must be drawn from that ritual chant, which is a collective kind of performance of communitarian transformation, and the howl of the wounded dog. Um, and these two are combined as sources by Savitri as a performer in order to create the sound that the sonic character of what the lamenting mother should sound like. And what I'm suggesting here is that there is a certain kind of continuity between this description and what we actually see at different points in performances like Pebet in Loy, which many of us have not seen, in Memoirs of Africa, which was first staged in 1985, and finally in Draupadi in the final scene. The howling of the violated and wounded Draupadi. There is a moment of inception of this kind of continuity of physical performance, which manages to resonate a certain kind of pain, which is what becomes the sort of the really sort of unforgettable experience of watching a play like Draupadi or watching something like Pebet. So the ritual chanting of the Kapui tribe and the howling of a wild dog came together in Savitri's lament in order to cut through the settled expectations of the audience from a realistic social melodrama. So plot-wise, Tamlalai does remain a social melodrama of a certain kind, but in a sense, the performance, because it was being pushed outside the sort of pedagogic framework of melodramatic performance and social drama, was acquired another kind of an edge, which I think later develops into something much deeper in Kanhailal's work. It created a different mode of expressive address that managed to resonate with an accumulated experience of communitarian suffering. So these are important words to me that I find difficult to avoid when talking about Kanhailal's work: resonance and communitarian suffering, and exceeded the mere plot of Tamlalai to reach a mythical pitch. This was perhaps the beginning of the quest that finally led Kalakshetra as a collective to a long-standing training practices where actors did their best to become animals. And this happens today. If you ever watch any of the recordings of Savitri's lecture demonstration, you'll find much of her repertoire, actually, which makes the audience laugh and roll on the floor and splits, actually consists in her becoming certain kinds of animal or mimicking the sounds of birds, mimicking the sounds of a donkey, becoming a monkey in the performance page. And people think that these are things that she does as ways to kind of engage the audience with laughter. But the thing is that this is kind of very central to her performance practice. So where actors did their best to become animals, attempting to embody the sounds, movements, and emotions of creatures other than human. These practices rested on the belief that the bodies of actors, when stripped of their urban social inhibitions, became capable of spilling out of the limiting frames of conventional theatrical realism to express a different order of dreamlike reality. In these states, the actors embody extreme states of vulnerability that find resonance with the collective memories of a silenced and traumatized community. To embody and not simply represent human beings in states of absolute physical disintegration, driven to the limits of endurance through unimaginable experiences of pain and torture, as in Draupadi and in Memoirs of Africa, it became necessary to undo civilized notions of what constituted the human and reach towards different orders of bodily experience. As I have written elsewhere on the subject of Savitri Heisnam's method, and quoting a bit from myself, in our conversations, Savitri often spoke of her need as an actor to withdraw from the soul-killing noises of the city and listening to the sound of animals, learning to imitate their movements. It was important to her, it seemed to me, that she knew how to become animal, in order that she may not shrink from encountering the horror of the human body in a state of absolute violation or degradation. The body for Savitri in her work with Kanhailal became a resonator attuned sharply towards catching reverberations of pain that were not her own. Kanhailal himself gives us an astute analysis of these early years of exploration, of which Tamnalai became a turning point. What Kalakshetra could accomplish artistically was a kind of ethno-oratorio of modern native theatre, while making the evolution of a language a physical rather than a psychological process. Our language, as solidified by social experience and through the renewal of ancestral traditions and the retelling of folk tales, is a highly physical and visceral response to bitter political conditions. It was as if a trace of a pathway had been found which led towards the future, a future where political reality in Manipur would become increasingly fraught, and Kanhailal's own language would resonate with sharper notes of resistance and communitarian pride. So I'm going to stop here. I can just now leave it up open to questions for everybody. Uh, No, I'd rather have a sort of, this is part of a much longer paper that I wrote, and I don't think I can go through all of it. But I think it gives a sense of where I'm trying to go through this. So we can now open it for questions. If nobody minds, can I just take a 2-minute break and I'll be back while you think of the questions? Is that all right, Prodosh?
Sure, we can do that. So in the meanwhile, thank you a lot, Dr. Trina Nileena Banerjee, for this wonderful and insightful lecture. I understand that probably the online form might get tedious in times of pandemic, where without a face-to-face interaction, but nevertheless, we would encourage comments, questions, both in English and in Bangla. You can keep your ideas, out here as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question. It can be something that you want to share, so that we can, have a sort of discussion. Quite a few takeaways from the lecture, and I, when Trina joins us, probably I am quite curious. The student in me have some questions, or rather, points of interest that maybe she can talk about. So, in a way, the idea, I think the core, which has been pointed out and it's wonderfully said, is where Kanhailal says that here in Imphal we don't think of tomorrow. I think that itself is something very significant to the context in which we, as probably new practitioners or academicians or people with interest in theatre, can look at such works. That in a typical literary mode, we look at authors. You will look at Kanhailal as an author, but immediately, when you come to the realm of theatre, it opens up into his mode of practice. And probably, this particular statement, here in Imphal, we don't think of tomorrow, significant in a time probably, where the idea of the nation state itself has this promissory semantic of appearing, that everything about the nation is going to be invested in the future, while the present is completely in disarray. And I felt the lecture to a great extent, and thanks to Trina that she points this out. I do have a few points of question once you join, so we will wait. And in the meanwhile, you can have your own observations and questions. Please post it in the comment section, and we'll be taking them up for a brief discussion, probably 15 minutes. Namuninda, 15 minutes is fine. If we go for 15 more minutes.
So I'm here. I mean,
15 minutes is fine. Huh?
So yes, thank you, Trina, for that very insightful and very intense kind of lecture. I was just sharing.
Feeling that it was becoming too dense, so I thought let's stop here and just open it for.
Yeah, and also it's the form. The online form is a bit tedious as well. So, but having said that, the student in me, I know I am a moderator here and probably supposed to field questions from the live, but till there are questions, I had some kind of observations or questions. I think a very key takeaway from your lecture is where you did point out to that idea by Kanhailal, where he says that here in Imphal we don't think of tomorrow. And I was just sharing that, it's kind of significant in the kind of problematic promissory semantics that the nation state plays by kind of relegating everything to the future, while everything in the present seems to be is in disarray. And talk to us probably as much as you can. You have kind of talked about it, but to what extent can this be earmarked through Draupadi? And Draupadi, it's something which is taken from Mahashita Devi, but it does have a transformation from that text to the performance text of Draupadi. So your observations on that, how would you look at as a student in theatre, or as someone who is enthusiastic for the practice of theatre? How would we kind of inhabit that space? I would not use the word read, because it makes it kind of textualized. But how can we inhabit that space that Draupadi, in its very specific context, delineates? But how can we inhabit that space? Because you did talk about that in your lecture.
See, I haven't. Thank you for that question. I haven't quite thought of it in this way. But the thing about, if you just look at the empirics of it in terms of dates and things, so Mahashita Devi writes this story in 1978, and Dubdi Mejen is a Shantal woman who's a cadre of the Naxalite movement, right? And so 1978 মানে হচ্ছে তোমার এমার্জেন্সি জাস্ট শেষ হয়েছে, হ্যাঁ, এবং বাংলা একটা আই থিঙ্ক অগ্নিগর্ভ বলে কোন একটা গল্পটা বেরোচ্ছে। এবার 1900, এবং আমরা জানি, যখন আমরা জিজ্ঞেস করি যে তাহলে এমার্জেন্সি মানে ডেট গুলো কি ছিল, আমরা বলি 75 থেকে 77 ইন্দিরা গান্ধী করেছিলেন, এবং এটা দিস আর দ্য ফ্যাক্টস অফ দ্য ম্যাটার। এবার 81তে ট্রান্সলেশন বেরোচ্ছে স্পিভাকের ক্রিটিক্যাল কোয়ারিতে, যতদূর মনে পড়ছে আমার, আই থিঙ্ক। কিন্তু এই 78 এবং 81-র মধ্যে আরেকটা ঘটনা ঘটে গেছে, যেটা কিন্তু আমাদের কোট অ্যান্ড কোট ন্যাশনাল হিস্ট্রির অংশ নয়। মানে তুমি যদি এরিয়া স্টাডিজের লোক, তোমার নর্থ ইস্ট সম্পর্কে থাকে, তাহলে তুমি জানতে পারবে 1980-তে কিন্তু আফস্পা মণিপুরে লাগু। আমরা মনে করছি এমার্জেন্সি শেষ হয়ে গেছে। But that paradigm is really applies to the mainland. But for as far as Manipur is concerned, a much greater state of emergency begins from 1980 onwards, right? So I mean, and this is just about Manipur. এরকম হাজারোটা এক্সাম্পল আছে। আমরা যদি 66-67 কথা বলি, তাহলে আমরা বলি হ্যাঁ নকশালবাড়ি হচ্ছিল, এবং এই ঘটনা ভিয়েতনাম নিয়ে একটা তালমাটাল চলছিল, যে মানে 66 সালে যে মিজোরামে কি ঘটছিল, কতটা বম্বিং অ্যাকচুয়ালি ইন্ডিয়ান স্টেট সেখানে সেই সালে করেছে, এই সমস্ত কথাগুলো অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমাদের মানে রেডারেই আসে না কোথাও। somehow it's kind of left out of that radar. So therefore এবার 80-তে যখন এটা আমরা দেখছি আফস্পা ইম্পোজড হচ্ছে, এইবার 2000 সালে, এবং এই গল্পটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি এখানে নেই, বাট আমার অন্য লেখা এসছে, সৌমিকদার লেখাতেও এসে, Shomik Bandyopadhyay is in Imphal having a conversation with Kanhailal, and as the conversation, and Shomik tells this story much better, as the conversation goes on, and they're in this Kalakshetra Manipur is a campus that is just next to the hills. So Manipur is basically a valley surrounded by these hills, and so the regions surrounding just where the hills end are called Langol. তো এরমই একটা জায়গায় লাঙ্গল লাইমালাই বলে একটা জায়গায় কলাক্ষেত্রের ইয়েটা আছে, এবং কানহাইলাল ওখানে দাঁড়িয়ে শ্রমিক, মানে this is the conversation that is going on with Professor Shomik Bandyopadhyay. He's pointing out several houses, in each of which a person has been incarcerated or a woman raped, right? And at this point of time, Shomik mentions to him this story by Mahashita Devi called Draupadi, and suggests that he read it. He tells him the story. Kanhailal reads it, and then tells the story to Savitri, who does not in fact read English or Hindi or Bengali. And they decide to then perform it because to them it seems a story of their time. Right. So what is a myth? A myth is that which can be retold and activized again and again. Right. Uh, but a myth is often also understood as outside the political, because the political is meant to be inside history of a certain kind of linearity. But if you actually look back at how, let's say, even how Walter Benjamin is talking about time in the concept of history, you'll remember that the notion that there is in fact a spark that is ignited across time. The moment of July, 1830, where the clocks are shot at, time comes to a stop, still stellar. And that finds then, so the onward march of homogeneous empty time, which is the linear time of nation, as Benedict Anderson will tell you later, is brought to a stop by this moment of messianic time. And what is messianic time? That does not work in this kind of horizontal linearity. It sparks across time to connect, to resonate across different moments of rupture, of bringing to a standstill. So Benjamin talks about the idea that you can So who are we? What is messianic time? And he begins with this sentence that almost has always sort of driven chills down my spine, which is, we are the people who have been expected. So the Messiah is not he who is coming. We are invested with a weak messianic power because we were expected. And primarily, if you think of the time in history in Germany that he's writing, this is primarily a criticism of the Social Democrats, who thought that revolution would come even if they did nothing, and fascism was not a possibility because it could not happen in the forward march of civilization, right? And they believed that nobody had to pull the brakes, nobody had to bring things to a standstill. We would automatically sort of progress towards. So this idea of inevitable progressivism is what Benjamin is writing against, that somebody needed to get up and pull the brakes, right? And that break in time, that rupture, is the still stellar, which gets resonated, echoed across different moments in history, repeated almost like a certain kind of a myth, the coming of the Messiah, right? So if we keep that sense of time in mind, we realize that if you think of Draupadi as a myth, Draupadi as a myth from the Mahabharata, Draupadi as Mahashita Devi writes it, Draupadi re-envisioned in Manipur, and you remember that Kanhailal does not adapt it. It's still Draupadi magic. It's not a Meitei woman by any stretch of the imagination, but it makes perfect sense. In 2000, it gets performed again. And you will remember not much after Kanhailal's death, there is a production in Haryana which gets of Draupadi the story, which gets attacked by a right-wing student organization and stopped. So almost as a kind of mythical performance narrative, Draupadi is activized again and again. And I think in some senses Kanhailal was probably aware of that, because when Kangla happens, if you asked him about it, he actually told me this. He said there was no direct empirical connection, and I have not been able to find it. Like when I've interviewed, many people have interviewed the imas, the mothers who protested at Kangla. Nobody said they had any knowledge of Draupadi, which was in 2000, and the protest happened in 2004. But when I asked Kanhailal, he said it was a historical echo. I don't know if he was aware of Benjamin. I mean, I would say most likely he probably hadn't read Concept of History. But the thing is, this is exactly the word he used. He said it was a historical echo. Right. So, I think that's my comment on this.
Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot for that. Actually, this is I think in your essay as well, where you talk about performing the secular, making the sacred public. I was quite impressed by that idea where you talk about, very subtly about certain aspects of the academics. Just as you mentioned, the Kangla আর তার 4 বছর আগের যে ইনসিডেন্টটা, এই দুটোর মধ্যে কোনো যোগাযোগ আছে কিনা সেই লজিকটা হয়তো বার করা সম্ভব নয়, কিন্তু বা এম্পেরিক্যালি সম্ভব নয়, কিন্তু it makes us rethink our positions, যে the logic that academia or research বা যে কোনো রকমের অনুসন্ধান ফলো করে. I think that is significant, and that is how we can take inspiration to look at Kanhailal. Not only that, do we go further, because I don't know if there are any questions in the group. এখনো কোনো প্রশ্ন তো সেরকম কিছু দেখতে পাচ্ছি না।
এখনো আমিও খুব একটা প্রশ্ন দেখতে পাচ্ছি না বা কোনো মন্তব্য কোনো আসেনি।
ট্রিনাদি কিছু ছবি দেখাতে চাইছিলে বোধহয়।
I can show them. A second.
সেটা একটু দেখি আমরা কন্ট্রোল করব।
I'm not very familiar with this platform, so I don't even know how do we, how many people do we have watching? We can't tell, right?
Normally that do we know about the viewership? মানে কজন? I can't also.
এক্ষুনি বলে দিচ্ছি, সেকেন্ড। এখন সম্ভবত দেখছে হচ্ছে 12 অথবা 13 জন।
আচ্ছা, মানে ছবি দেখার লোক আছে, আমি সেইটুকুই জানতে চাইছি।
তা আছে।
ঠিক আছে, তাহলে আমি শেয়ার করছি। এক সেকেন্ড।
হ্যাঁ, 13 জন মতন আছে, ঠিক বলেছেন।
শেয়ার স্ক্রিন দাঁড়া। ওকে, একটু টাইম লাগছে। হ্যাঁ, ফটোজ দেখা যাচ্ছে কি?
হ্যাঁ,
চালু হয়।
দেখা যাচ্ছে
এইবার স্ট্রিম। হ্যাঁ, দেখা যাচ্ছে।
পুরো একেবারে সোজাসুজি কলাক্ষেত্রের আর্কাইভ থেকে আমাকে ওরা খুব কাইন্ডলি এই ছবিগুলো দিয়েছেন। আমি মানে দেখাতে পারি obviously, but these are not for publishing or anything, so please don't take any screenshots. I would request you. আচ্ছা, anyone. তো এটা দ্রৌপদী প্রোডাকশন থেকে, এটা this is a late, so there were 2 versions of দ্রৌপদী, যেখানে মানে I have records of it, but I've also talked to Kanhailal sir about it. It's basically the production got more and more pared down. Initially উনি ভেবেছিলেন যে অ্যাকচুয়ালি বন্দুক থাকবে যারা সৈন্য তাদের হাতে, কিন্তু পরের দিকে এই সমস্ত যত প্যারাফার্নেলিয়া অনেক কমিয়ে this became মানে much more kind of minimalist. এবং প্রথম যখন এটা স্টেজ হয়, আমি বোধহয় 2001-এ প্রথমবার নান্দিকার ফেস্টিভ্যালে কলকাতায় দেখেছিলাম। 2000 সালে প্রথম মণিপুরে স্টেজড হয়েছিল, কিন্তু প্রথম দুটো, আর এটা নিয়ে আমি অনেকবারই লিখেছি, এমনি ওপেন সোর্স এসেতেও আছে, পাওয়া যাবে। সেটা হচ্ছে যে প্রথম দুটো শোর পরে মণিপুরে আর কোনো শো হয়নি। 2000 সালে এপ্রিলে বোধহয় দুটো শো হয়েছিল, তারপর বন্ধ হয়ে যায়, কেননা একটা বিশাল বিতর্কের ঝড় ওঠে মণিপুরি সংবাদপত্রগুলোতে, যেখানে অনেক নারীবাদীরাও, মণিপুরি নারীবাদীরাও আপত্তি করেন শেষ দৃশ্যটা নিয়ে, যেখানে সাবিত্রী নগ্ন হয়ে স্টেজে আসেন, এবং সেটাকে এক ধরনের মণিপুরি নারীর অবমাননা হিসেবে দেখা হয় এবং বলা হয় যেটার কি দরকার ছিল ইত্যাদি। এবং সেই কারণেই এটা সাজেস্ট করা হয় কানহাইলালের কাছে কি উনি এই শেষ দৃশ্যটা, নগ্নতাটা বাদ দিয়ে যদি শেষ দৃশ্যটা করা যায়, এবং উনি কিছুতেই সেটা করতে, উনি বা সাবিত্রী রাজি হন না। তাই ইম্ফলে অ্যাকচুয়ালি এই নাটকের পারফরমেন্স আর তারপরের বহু বছর হয় না। ইতিমধ্যে কলকাতা শহরে, দিল্লিতে জাতীয় নাট্য যে উৎসবগুলোতে দ্রৌপদী এক ধরনের মানে আনপ্রেসিডেন্টেড একটা ইম্প্যাক্ট হয়, এবং একভাবে একটা ল্যান্ডমার্ক প্রযোজনা হয়ে ওঠে। কিন্তু আইরনিক্যালি ইম্ফলে কিন্তু আর শো হয় না। হয় সে গিয়ে 2014-তে, এবং এই শোটিতে আমি উপস্থিত ছিলাম। মণিপুর ইউনিভার্সিটির একটা কানহাইলালের কাজ নিয়ে এক ধরনের একটা কোলোকিয়াম হয় মণিপুর ইউনিভার্সিটির সাপোর্টে, এবং সেখানে মণিপুর ইউনিভার্সিটির নিজস্ব হলে এটার একটা পারফরমেন্স হয়, এবং সে একটা অভূতপূর্ব অভিজ্ঞতা। কেননা আমি বোধহয় অনেকবারই ততদিনে দ্রৌপদী দেখে ফেলেছি, কিন্তু আমরা হলে বসে আছি, দেখছি, এবং স্টেজে আপনারা এই দৃশ্যটি, এরকম একটি দৃশ্য দেখছেন, এবং যেখানে আর্মি স্টেজে রয়েছে, কিন্তু পুরো হলটা আইল জুড়ে বন্দুক হাতে আর্মির জওয়ানরা দাঁড়িয়ে আছেন এবং স্টেজেও আমরা আর্মিকে দেখতে পাচ্ছি। আমার পক্ষে এর মতো সুরিয়াল পারফরমেন্স দেখার অভিজ্ঞতা অ্যাকচুয়ালি হয়নি। মানে স্টেজে এটা দেখতে দেখতে আমরা আইলে অ্যাকচুয়ালি আর্মি দাঁড়িয়ে আছে সিকিউরিটি দেওয়ার জন্য, এটা আমরা অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমাদের অভিজ্ঞতা হয়েছে 2014-তে। কিন্তু এই বৃহৎ সময় ধরে কিন্তু মণিপুরে আর এই নাটকটি অভিনীত হয়নি। এটা ডাকঘর নাটকের একটি দৃশ্য, যেখানে দ্রৌপদী ষাটোর্ধ্ব মানে অর্ধ মানে প্রায় 70 হতে চলেছে এই সময় উনি অমল চরিত্রে অভিনয় করেন এবং আনফরগেটেবল একটা পারফরমেন্স, যারা দেখেছেন তাদের মনে থাকবে। আবারও সুধা আর অমল ডাকঘর একটা এটা কলাক্ষেত্রের কোর্টইয়ার্ডে, এটা তখনও বাড়িটা এটা এখন পাকা হয়ে গেছে, একটা গ্যালারি হয়েছে জায়গাটা, কিন্তু কানহাইলাল কাজ করছেন এই জায়গাটায় বসে উনি অনেক সময় কাজ করতেন। ক্লাস চলছে এখানে। যে সামনে যে মেয়েটি বসে আছে সে বহু বছর ধরে যে ইয়াঙ্গার দ্রৌপদীর চরিত্রটি করতো, ওর নাম বেম বেম। আর তার পাশে টাইসন, ও অনেক দিনের পুরনো অভিনেতা কলাক্ষেত্রের। সাবিত্রী ক্লাস নিচ্ছেন এখানে। অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমাদের বাংলা থিয়েটারে অনেকেই হয়তো অনেক সময় মানে যেভাবে কনভেনশনালি কাজ করা হয় এখানে কিন্তু মানে ভয়েস এবং শরীরের ট্রেনিং অনেক সময় মানে বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রেই আলাদা করা হয় না, সুতরাং মানে দুটো একে অপরের সাথে একেবারে জড়িয়ে থাকে যেভাবে ট্রেনিং হয়। অনেক সময় ঘরের বাইরে ওপেন এয়ারে কাজ করা হয়, কেননা কানহাইলাল বিশ্বাস করতেন যে এতে শরীরের এক ধরনের এক্সপ্যান্সিভনেস আসে। and this is Tomba, Kanhailal's son, who now is the director of Kalakshetra. এটা ওদের কলাক্ষেত্রের মধ্যে যে থিয়েটার, একটা ছোট থিয়েটার আছে, সেখানে রিহার্সাল হচ্ছে। দ্রৌপদীর শেষ দৃশ্য। এইটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি মেমোয়ার্স অফ আফ্রিকার কিছু স্থির চিত্র। এগুলো দেখলে মানে পারফরমেন্সটা দেখলে আরো পরিষ্কার হয়, কিন্তু এই দুটো নাটকের মধ্যে আমার দৃঢ় বিশ্বাস একটা খুব গভীর যোগ আছে। যদিও এইটা প্রাইমারিলি জাস্ট একটা সোলো পারফরমেন্স, স্বল্প দৈর্ঘ্যের, যেটা সাবিত্রী একা তৈরি করেছিলেন 1985 সালে এনএসডিতে একটা রেসিডেন্সির সময়। কিন্তু দুটো নাটকের মধ্যে অ্যাকচুয়ালি দুটো পারফরমেন্সের মধ্যে আমার ধারণা দ্রৌপদী আর মেমোয়ার্সের মধ্যে একটা খুব গভীর যোগ আছে। এটাও মেমোয়ার্সের। আমি একটা পারফরমেন্স ওই 2014 নাগাদ ইম্ফলে দেখেছি মেমোয়ার্সের। এটা আবার পেবের থেকে। এটাও মেমোয়ার্স, এটা মেমোয়ার্স অফ আফ্রিকা। এটা তো দেখি বোঝাচ্ছে পেবেতের একটা ভার্সন অ্যাকচুয়ালি ইউটিউবে অ্যাভেলেবল আছে, একটা খুব পুরনো ভার্সন। আচ্ছা, তো এই কটা ছবি দেখানো ছিল, স্টপ করছি।
থ্যাংক ইউ ট্রিনাদি, অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ বিজি শিডিউলের মধ্যে সময় বার করার জন্য, এবং আনন্দ গ্রুপ অফ কন্টেম্পোরারি স্টাডিজ বাবুটাকেও অনেক অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ এটা অর্গানাইজ করার জন্য। আশা করি আপনাদের আজকে সন্ধ্যা ভালোভাবে কেটেছে এবং এটা থেকে অনেক কিছু ভাবনা চিন্তা আমাদের।
কোনো ফিডব্যাক এলে একটু আমি জানিও। একেবারে কারোর মুখ দেখতে না পারা এবং কোনো
সেই একদমই তাই আমাদের পক্ষেও না এখন পর্যন্ত কোনো কমেন্ট বাই আসেনি, কিন্তু অনেক আমি এটা জানি যে অনেক ছাত্রছাত্রী এবং ইয়াং অডিয়েন্স এটার দিকে তাকিয়ে আছে। মানে আমার কিছু এক্স ছাত্রছাত্রীদের তো আমি বলেইছিলাম, কারণ একটা হচ্ছে যে কানাইলাল অনেক সিলেবাসে এখন ইন্ট্রোডিউস হচ্ছে, কিন্তু সেভাবে চর্চা কানাইলালকে নিয়ে চর্চা খুব একটা মেইন স্ট্রিম সিলেবাসে নেই। সেই জন্য এটাও একটা খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং জায়গা যে তারা কিভাবে এটাকে জানবে, বা জানলেও কোনো একটা অজানা জায়গা থেকে যাচ্ছে। কিন্তু আমার মনে হয় এই ধরনের সেশনস এর জন্য আমাদের আরো উপকার হয়, যেখানে we get to think through. So it has been really rich and dense, even though we have not had much questions here, but I'm sure we have reached the people who wanted to. So thank you, Navanilda. It's over to you. তুমি conclude করে দাও।
হ্যাঁ, অনেক ধন্যবাদ জানাই তিনাদিকে। অনেক ব্যস্ততার মধ্যে, কাজের মধ্যে, বিজি শিডিউলের মধ্যে আপনি রাজি হয়েছেন এটা করবার জন্য। তার জন্য আমি বিশেষভাবে কৃতজ্ঞতা জ্ঞাপন করছি। এবং প্রদোষের কাছেও, আমি প্রদোষকে বলেছিলাম এটা মডারেট করবার জন্য, তো প্রথম কথাতেই রাজি হয়ে যায়। তার জন্য প্রদোষকেও অনেক ধন্যবাদ, তার কারণ ওর অনেক কাজ থাকে, পড়ানো,
আমার কোনো কাজ নেই।
এটা হলো কি প্রথম কথা। এবং আচ্ছা, একটা কমেন্ট এসছে,
Joshudhara Sen লিখছেন, thank you for this excellent initiative. Thank you, Joshudhara, for staying and being patient with us.
আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ, এটা হলো যে প্রথম কথা। আর দ্বিতীয় কথা হচ্ছে, আমি বেশি সময় নেব না, অনেকটাই সময় গিয়েছে, জাস্ট আমি দুটো কথা বলে শেষ করবো। প্রথম হচ্ছে, আপনারা হয়তো অনেকেই জানেন যে আমরা আগে অফলাইন ফরম্যাটে করতাম, মানে যেরকমভাবে সেমিনার হয়ে থাকে সাধারণত। কিন্তু গত বছর এই কোভিড প্যান্ডেমিক এসবের জন্য আমরা করতে পারিনি। মাঝখানে 3 মাস বন্ধ ছিল, নভেম্বর, ডিসেম্বর, জানুয়ারি, ফেব্রুয়ারি, এই 3 মাস। আমরা আবার ফেব্রুয়ারি থেকে শুরু করেছি। তো ফলত আজ সকালে আমাকে দু একজন যেহেতু জিজ্ঞাসা করেছিলাম, সে কারণে কথাটা বলছি যে সামনের মাসে আপনারা অনেকেই জানেন বা সবাই জানি আমরা যে সত্যজিৎরার 100 বছর হচ্ছে, সেন্টিনারি হচ্ছে। তো সেই কারণে একটা তিনটে শুক্রবার নিয়ে একটা ওয়েবিনার সিরিজ থাকছে, বেশ কয়েকজন বলবেন, সেটা 2-1 দিনের মধ্যেই আমি শেয়ার করবো পোস্টারটা। আর শেষ কথা হলো গিয়ে, এই যে আনন্দ গ্রুপ অফ কন্টেম্পোরারি স্টাডিজ, এটা করার একটা কারণ আছে। সেটা হলো গিয়ে, এটা আমার বাবার নামে, বাবার স্মৃতিতে করা। এবং বাবাও যেহেতু নিজে অধ্যাপনার সাথে যুক্ত ছিলেন দীর্ঘদিন, অনেক বছর, তো বাবার নামেই এটা করা। এবং আমরা এবছর থেকে আমাদের স্বল্প ক্ষমতায়, আমাদের যেটুকু ক্ষমতাশীল, আমরা একটা ছোট্ট স্কলারশিপ চালু করছি, যেখানে যারা অর্থনৈতিকভাবে অতটা স্বাবলম্বী নন বা অর্থনৈতিকভাবে অতটা সক্ষম নন, তাদের পড়াশোনার খরচটা বহন করবার জন্য আমরা ঠিক করেছি। এবং সেটা আমরা এই বছর থেকে শুরু করতে চলেছি, এবং আরো বেশ কিছু কাজ রয়েছে। এটাই হলো এই টেস্টটা করার মূল লক্ষ্য, যাতে অনুষ্ঠানের মাধ্যমে আমরা বাবাকেও স্মরণ করতে পারি। আর বেশি কিছু বলবো না। তিনাদিকে আবার অনেক ধন্যবাদ, প্রদোষকে ধন্যবাদ। আচ্ছা, একজন মন্তব্য করেছেন, আচ্ছা, অনিন্দিতা বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়, থ্যাংক ইউ ফর অর্গানাইজিং সাচ এ গুড প্রোগ্রাম। অনেক ধন্যবাদ, নমস্কার।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
And podcast.